or Pesca de Flores as they call it, and so he named this land La Florida. He did not discover Florida, however. There were thousands of Timucuan Indians already here. What he did discover was the Gulf Stream. And that was a really important discovery for Spain because the Gulf Stream is where the water runs much more swiftly, more so than that of the wind, and it allowed the Spanish galleons that were laden with gold and silver to get back to Spain much faster by as much as 3 weeks, making them less vulnerable to vicious Atlantic storms and pirate attacks. And try as they might, Spain was unable to establish a permanent settlement here for about 50 years or so. There were half a dozen attempts made, but they all failed for one reason or another. It wasn't until 1564 that a settlement appeared that seemed to have some staying power. Much to the ire of the King of Spain, it was not Spanish, but French. The Huguenots, or Protestants, had established Fort Caroline north of what is now Jacksonville, and this encroachment into Spanish territory angered the King of Spain so much, he sent for his greatest admiral, Don Pedro Menendez de Aviez, and he sent him here to do 3 things: eliminate the French threat, establish a permanent Spanish colony, and Christianize the locals here. Menendez set out to do just exactly that, and he arrived right in time as there was a big hurricane brewing out in the Atlantic. That didn't stop Menendez, though. He took his men, marched north through the swamps, came upon Fort Caroline, found it to be rather lightly guarded. The French had taken their ships out to sea, hoping to capture Menendez's armada before he landed. Well, that was a big mistake by the French, as they ended up sailing right into that hurricane and shipwrecking south of here. Menendez quickly captured and destroyed Fort Caroline, took his men, headed south, rounded up all those French soldiers about 12 miles from here, and he asked them one very important question. Are you Catholic? All those that answered no were marched behind the dunes and put to the sword. All those that said they would convert to Catholicism if they would preserve their lives were also marched behind the dunes and put to the sword. Now, this was after some consideration by Menendez. He wasn't a monster. He simply did not have the supplies to feed the additional men. Now, that was the end of the Huguenot here in Florida, and it's also how the bay in front of St. Augustine got its name. It's named Matanzas, which is Spanish for massacre or slaughter. Now, 21 years later, the Protestants would get their revenge, and that was when Sir Francis Drake came. He had 42 vessels, 2,000 men. He sacked the city and forced all of our inhabitants into the swamp. It was then that Spain realized if they wanted to hold on to this colony, they would need to build some fortifications. St. Augustine was to become the first presidio, or walled city here in the New World. We have built a replication of the Cuba line, this palm log structure running from the fort, passing through the city gates here on the left, and you'll also find some coming up on the right. And this was the northern border of the city. And if I were to make a left turn at our next intersection, that's where the Rosario line stood, or the western border. Now, we are bounded by water on the southern and eastern side, so there wasn't much of a concern there. The Rosario line was primarily an earthworks wall, and it is now completely buried under Cordova Street and the surrounding buildings. We have reproduced one of the redoubts that stood along the wall, so. Over on the right, this log structure is the Santo Domingo Redoubt. Now, there were 9 of these redoubts, and they were manned 24/7 with soldiers. As we pass by it, take a look inside, you'll see the notches where the cannons would have stood. The Spanish also intentionally planted all the yucca plants around the redoubts and the walls. They called that Spanish bayonet because of how sharp the fronds are. Now, we're going to take a little jump in history from our founding story to talk about this 1910 Orange Street School, the building on the left. Now, that is built in the remains of the moat of the Presidio, and it's actually sunk into the ground since it was built. When it first opened, it served students from grades 1 to 12, and the teachers that taught here were paid a whopping $20 a month to teach. Students from outlying areas were brought in by horse and wagon, and the wagon drivers were also paid $20 for their job. Hardly seems fair. Over here on the right, this beautiful building is the historic parking garage where people have been parking their cars since 2006. Yeah, I know it's not very historically significant. What is, though, is the property. On this property once stood Florida's first Grand Hotel, the San Marco. In size, nothing like it had been previously seen. It was 260 feet long, It had 3 towers in the front. The center tower was 113 feet tall, and it was said you could see it 9 miles from sea. If you've ever seen any of the earlier aerial photographs of the Castillo de San Marcos, they were likely taken from the roof of the San Marco. It also had electricity, steam heat, and Otis elevators. Had its own theater with scenery loft and footlights. Built by wealthy Boston merchant Isaac Cleft, who was originally a shipbuilder. Henry Flagler came and stayed here on a honeymoon with his second wife. Burnt down mysteriously, though, in 1897. Mysteriously, we say, because the St. Augustine Fire Department found all of the hoses on the one and only fire engine were cut, and that prevented them from extinguishing the blaze. Inside job, outside job, nobody knows. Now, once this traffic clears, we'll be able to get our way up to the Visitor Information Center. And that is our stop number 3. And the Visitor Information Center is one of the last buildings made out of coquina, the same material the fort is made out of. Built by the Works Progress Administration in 1938. Today it is a free museum with a replica of a Spanish galleon built inside it. You'll also find a lovely gift shop and one of our discount ticket booths. Now you can spend half of your day just reading the history that's posted on the walls and the pillars around. And if you do go, be sure to take a look in the courtyard on the left-hand side of the Visitor Information Center. Sorry, left, that's a bad direction. On the western side of the Visitor Information Center. And inside that courtyard, you'll find a mosaic depicting the Old Town Plan. Now, if this is your stop, just wait for me to get to that complete stop. Remember to back down as you would.